Hello, everyone. I'm Dave O'Neill. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Indeed, and I'd like to welcome you to this installment of Here to Help, which is Indeed's look at how we've been navigating the global impact of COVID-19. Our CEO, Chris Himes, has been sharing a number of conversations covering what we are doing as a business to help job seekers and employers all over the world at this critical time, and I'm happy to host today's installment. Seems every day we're exposed to news and information relating to this health and economic crisis, and it can prove difficult to make sense of it all and understand the implications. So today I'm thrilled to be joined by Jed Kolko, Indeed's Chief Economist, who will help us understand the trends and data and try to make sense of the impact COVID-19 is having on jobs and the global economy. Jed has been with Indeed for about 4 years now. He previously spent time working at Trulia, which is now part of the Zillow Group, where he focused on the housing market and, of course, the impact the economy has on real estate. And he's also spent time as a researcher for Bloomberg, focused on the future of work, and with the Public Policy Institute of California and with Forrester Research. Jed is joining us today from San Francisco. Jed, good morning.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you with us. And to start, all of our worlds have been turned completely upside down in the last couple of months. How are you doing right now? How are you handling the current situation?
You know, I think I'm doing as well as can be. So many of us are used to working from home some of the time. I mean, the biggest change for me in terms of work has been not traveling. You know, it's been great not to be jet lagged, but that's probably the biggest way in which my own personal rhythms have changed. Fortunately, I know how to cook. I know how to cook in big batches. I know how to cook sort of efficiently. So that part's been easy. There are lots of people I miss. I just had a big birthday and had to think, of an entirely different way to bring people together to celebrate things. But if that's as bad as it is, then it's doing pretty well for me for now.
Yeah, well, happy belated birthday to you. I mean, it's been really astounding to watch how different people have been impacted in very different ways as we've gone through this. And certainly, people being out of work and people being socially isolated can take a real toll. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. But I really wanted to start by finding out a little bit more about you. You're trained as an economist. I'm wondering what drew you to economics in your studies and what led you to make that a career.
So I got to economics a little bit later in the game. I was not an economics major in college. What I was always most interested in was cities and different places, and always had a very sort of urban planning, kind of curiosity. I think that maybe because I grew up in a place where I thought I would never stay for the rest of my life. I grew up in Rochester, New York, and always had the sense that it was a place with a really strong history and strong culture, but I would end up somewhere else. So always fascinated by the question of why things happen where they do, why people live where they do, why businesses locate where they do. And after enough school and learning about different ways of looking at the world, decided that, I believe that economics, more than everything else, made the world go round. So ended up after college, testing out some economics jobs, and then going to grad school in economics.
And you've been able to apply that, in really unique ways to, probably the two industry sectors that are most impacted by this discussion that you're talking about, where people choose to live. So your work at Trulia and now your work at Indeed, very much focused on the trends of, how the economy actually impacts these businesses. Can you talk about, the role of an economist at a tech firm?
Yes. So here at Indeed, we've got our hiring lab team. It's a team of economists and other researchers and editors who are doing a public service and helping build our brand and specifically our brand credibility by doing research about the labor market using both our own and sometimes publicly available data. We are very external facing. We talk to reporters. We talk to employers. Sometimes we talk directly to job seekers. It's very much a public-facing kind of role. Other companies have economists doing other things. So Amazon and Uber and some of the big marketplace companies have a lot of economists helping design auctions or set pricing. There are certain things that all economists can do, but we tend to be specialized. Like just in the same way that you probably wouldn't want a dermatologist to deliver your baby. There are lots of economics questions that I'm probably not the right person to answer. Though, in a pinch, probably better than someone right off the street for some of those economics questions.
Well, it's interesting, people might look at your background and see, undergrad degree from Harvard, PhD from Harvard, and expect you to have a lot of the answers, as we look forward into the future. But what you're saying is that's really not what your role is. Your role is really to, help envision possible scenarios and then plan for that.
Yeah. So as part of our research, one of the things that one learns in doing research is how hard it is to get to an answer or like make a great prediction or a great forecast. My classmates in graduate school always joke how like the more that we learned in grad school about economics, like the less sure we were of anything that we used to believe. And so part of being an economist is really understanding what we can know and why it's so hard to know other things that we wish we did. And then how to plan, how to understand the future, how to understand the labor market under the kind of uncertainty, especially that we're in now.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the way we treat our product testing at Indeed, right? We're a very data-driven company, and people often have predictions about the outcome or the potential outcome of a certain test that we might run, but ultimately you have to wait for the actual data to come in. And oftentimes people are really surprised, but helping look at different scenarios is really the key here. And you've helped our leadership team work through scenario planning exercises where we've looked not just at different economic situations, but different competitive environments, different product environments, and other things. Can you talk about the importance of scenario planning at a business?
Yeah, scenario planning is an incredibly powerful tool that's useful when it's hard to predict the future. When there are lots of different possibilities and you want to essentially play out the story of what the world might look like in several different scenarios. One of the things that often comes out of scenario planning is that you discover the different possibilities in the future that your decisions really depend on. Like if the world is in a recession, we do this. If it's not, we do that. But you also sometimes discover decisions that make sense to take that don't depend on what the world turns out to look like. Things that make sense to do regardless of what scenario you're in. And this is a kind of tool that's being used for some of the messiest, most uncertain questions that the world has faced. It was used by South Africa to figure out what the post-apartheid future would look like. So it's what you do when the question is too complicated to build a simple forecast and have a lot of faith in what that number is.
Yeah, it can really help you, I guess, evaluate some implicit assumptions that you might be making about your business that maybe you should be investigating just on an ongoing basis. We've found it as a leadership team to be a really useful exercise in envisioning, what we want the world to look like, and then trying to figure out what are the things that we can control and what are the things that are completely out of our control. And speaking of that, this week would have been Indeed's annual customer conference, which we call Indeed Interactive. So we've been hosting this for a number of years in Austin, where we bring hundreds or thousands of clients together to talk about the future of Indeed, talk about the constraints that our clients are having. Obviously, we're not having it this year in person. Instead, we are running a number of smaller virtual events that are focused on specific topics relevant to different client types. About a year ago, almost to the day, you were on stage at Indeed Interactive, and you were talking about the labor market and where things were going. Could you have imagined that we would be in this situation right now?
Well, the title of that presentation a year ago was "What Happens When the Good Times End?" Now, that is not because I had some crystal ball that told us we would be in this situation today a year ago. A year ago, The unemployment rate was very, very low by historical standards. There was lots of concern that for some employers, the labor market was getting difficult because it was so tight, so hard to find workers. And it felt like a scenario that couldn't last forever. And so some economists were starting to ask the question, could there be a slowdown soon? None of us asking that question could have predicted that it looked like what we're in today. No one had any sort of secret advanced information from those, behind the scenes conversations economists tend to have. It's the kind of thing that economists, think about, with the regular ups and downs in the economy. But what we're seeing today really looks so different than the recessions that we've seen over the past 50 years.
Yeah, and we've obviously gone through this crazy period. A year ago, people were wondering when that economic cycle, which began really on the recovery from the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, when that recovery would end. Because as you say, it's very typical to go through these different types of cycles. And it's also pretty typical to be facing global health crises every 10 or 11 years or so. If you look back through the last 100 years, there have been a whole number of these viruses where there weren't treatments that took quite a while to actually get your arms around. And the economic impact of this one obviously has been tremendous. You mentioned 50-year lows in the unemployment rate in the US, which we were seeing a year ago, and now we're at highs that we haven't seen literally since the Great Depression. And people are really, I think, struggling to digest this and figure out how it impacts them and really even how they can process and interpret what is going on in the world. How do you think about it?
So I think about what we're in right now as, first of all, the acute phase of a crisis. And we are still discovering what that means and what that looks like. But it's been a huge shift away from some sectors of the economy, sectors that have had to close to shut down, while at the same time, a shift toward sectors that help support the stay-at-home economy. So we've seen some firms, particularly grocery and delivery, rapidly hiring, even though at the same time, we know that job postings are down from where they were a year ago on our site. And so this first phase is this really dramatic shift as people are trying to manage by staying at home and protect their health. I think the big question is whether that acute phase turns into a longer term, more chronic phase. Will people be out of work for long enough? Will enough businesses go under that even after the end of the pandemic, whatever that means, whether that's a virus, whether that's a vaccine, whether it's enough testing and tracing, what does the economy look like then? Does it go close to back to normal? Or are we in for something that looks like a more conventional recession with more people out of work, businesses going under, less money to borrow? That's really the big question. Sort of how do we get from this acute phase into whatever comes next?
And are there leading indicators that you look at to try to suggest, what the eventual recovery might look like? What I think a lot of businesses are trying to figure out is how deep is this acute phase going to go, and then how long is it going to last? You're seeing 30 plus million people in the United States filing for unemployment. Is that going to be a 3-month or a 6-month displacement of those workers, or as you suggest, if it plays out over a much longer time period, there's going to be real underlying damage to the economy, and the spending patterns that we're used to, may be very slow to return. Are there things that you look at that give you some indication of which way this might play out?
Well, one thing that we look at, and that lots of people are looking at right now, is our own data on what's happened to the overall number of job postings. Has been a really useful guide to understanding where the impact is, what sectors are being most affected, and when it might turn around. Typically, when there's lots of uncertainty, people and companies try to do reversible things first. before they do things that are more expensive to reverse. So firms are likely to stop hiring before they take the step of laying people off. So tracking our trend in job postings is an incredibly useful way of understanding both the timing of this crisis as well as where the effects are. Now, as the crisis goes on, government data is starting to catch up. So last Friday in the US, we got the monthly jobs report that was a snapshot as of early mid-April. And that really showed, with a huge jump in the unemployment rate, the loss of about 20 million jobs, those data really now are showing the effect of the crisis on the economy. So increasingly, we can rely on some of the sort of more mainstream sources that we always use to understand the labor market, but some of the more real-time alternative sources like our own data have been incredibly valuable, especially right now.
Yeah, one of the most challenging things is, when you start seeing some positive indicators, like we have seen in our business, some indications that businesses are returning to being active in the hiring world, whether that's a good thing or whether that actually creates more mid to long-term risk. I mean, there's this, incredible balance that I think is going on in everybody's mind, which is between the public health crisis related to the virus, the impact on the economy, and ultimately the impact on the way of life and people's well-being and set of social interactions. And sometimes, we might see some indications that businesses are starting to reopen, but that may actually introduce more risk that there's a second wave of the virus coming, which actually, again, if you look back at some of the historical examples, might actually cause a bigger impact to the economy later on.
Yeah, that's right. I think both economists as well as epidemiologists and public health experts almost all agree that longer term, like what is good for public health is the same thing as what's good for the economy. I think, in the short term, it can look like public health and the economy might be in conflict or in tension, but that's short-term thinking. Longer term, what is good for public health, likely to be good for the economy. I think one of the challenges now is even understanding the data. There could be false starts that we see in the data that turn out not to be true when we get a few more weeks or months of data. And I mean, that argues for looking as widely at as much information as possible. So even though it's tempting to try to figure out what your single favorite indicator is and look for any signs of good news in that one indicator, when there's so much information and so much uncertainty, we need to hedge our bets when looking at data and looking across a wide range to see whether the good news that we see in one indicator or data series ends up being supported by what we see in all the others.
Well, so that's a great point, right? I mean, there's a tremendous amount of content out there. There's a tremendous amount of data, and there's certainly no shortage of opinions on what the appropriate reaction should be, what the future might look like. How do you decide on what information sources you deem to be credible, and what sources do you pay most attention to?
Thinking about what's a credible data source, what's credible information about the economy isn't that different than thinking about credible information about health. There are quacks out there. There are claims that this one indicator or this one view is the right way to do it. But what I've seen is that the sort of mainstream experts that aren't pushing an ideological line, that are thinking long term, and that have some context and have seen this before, are putting out some of the most thoughtful data and analysis about what's going on in this crisis. There's no secret piece of information out there that will give you the insight that nobody else has. At this point, there are so many people trying to understand what's happening now, what the future might look like, that the people who are writing broadly, great reporters at the New York Times, at the Wall Street Journal, at the Economist, at the Financial Times. They're often writing some of the most helpful pieces, helping make sense of all of this data and research and prediction out there.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, certainly it seems that the more aggressive you can be in a shutdown as early as possible, that may actually create the right conditions for a quicker recovery if the right mechanisms are in place or the right protections are in place when you do start to reopen businesses a little bit. It indeed we've been, I think, very cautious about the way that we've approached how to think about having employees return to the office. We recognize that for a lot of people, work from home is really challenging. So we want to create an opportunity for them to get back into the office if it can really positively impact them. But from a broad company perspective, we don't envision mandating that our employees go back into the office. Certainly, our thinking right now is before 2021. As you think about the impact that this environment is having on the world of work, we're very fortunate that our workers generally are quite capable of working remotely, and it's not so disruptive to our business. But when you look at the future of the way business works generally, how do you think of it? Is this going to be a somewhat permanent change to the way that people think of their location, to your earlier point on what you studied in the past, where they live, where they can work from, and who they work for?
Yeah, I think for businesses like ours, where it is possible for so many of us to work remotely, many businesses like ours will discover that working remotely, being more geographically distributed, works better than we might have imagined. Though some of us will discover that it's much harder than we ever imagined. We're really, in the middle or even the early stages of this, sudden forced experiment, putting us all, in, a completely unfamiliar both work and home life. I think, when you see what people are tweeting about or posting about, some people are, trying to figure out how to manage, incredibly difficult challenge of balancing their work, their family, their children's schooling, while other people have been fortunate enough to essentially discover new ways of working and new habits that they may want to hold on to in the future. I think it is so hard to predict ways in which the world is going to be different based on what this feels like right now. What we're doing in a pandemic is a really bad guide to ways in which the world is going to change 5 or 10 years from now. And people who seem really sure about ways in which the world is going to change might probably just be talking about their own hopes and fears and biases about the future rather than what's actually going to happen. But I do think there are lots of people in businesses who want to continue doing more things remotely. There'll be lots of businesses that unfortunately will need to operate at lower capacity. Restaurants that need to continue distancing, the travel segment, it's really unclear what getting back to normal is going to look like for them. So it matters so much what industry we're talking about and what people's personal circumstances are.
Yeah. Yeah, so Indeed has tried to rally a bunch of our resources to help job seekers in this environment, help them really piece together what the opportunities are and what's out there, and also to help employers who have these rapidly developing needs. What advice would you give to a job seeker in this environment? It's impossible to predict what actually is going to happen, but how should job seekers be thinking about this kind of environment and what type of role they might take and what that might mean for the longer term?
So I think for job seekers, there's no question it's a very challenging time. We've gone from a world where the unemployment rate was 3.5% to one where there is lots and lots of uncertainty right now. And even once that uncertainty passes, we're not going to get back to the tight labor market that we were in 2018 and 2019. So I think for some job seekers, thinking what they need from a job. How important is the income? How important is the insurance? How important is the personal and career growth? Job seekers might be making different choices about what to search for and where than they did in 2018, 2019. Also, I think different people might be searching for jobs. For someone who's in a good, secure job, they might be more hesitant to search in times of uncertainty. And we saw in last decade's recession that the share of people who voluntarily quit, left their job for another one or to take a break, fell by about half. So I think the mix of who's looking for a job and the types of jobs that are out there will change. They'll probably change back as we go from this acute phase possibly to a more chronic phase.
Yeah, really interesting. Historically, economic downturns and crises more broadly have spawned enormous amounts of innovation and created some of that change in the way people might want to see the world. You made the point earlier about people kind of bringing their own hopes and aspirations as to what the world might look like, and then being able to go out and actually execute on something new, design a new process, design a new product or solution. Does that history of innovation during these times, does that give you optimism about the future?
So I think what we're in right now looks so different than previous recessions that we may be in this for longer. There may be more people who are unemployed for a long period of time. And it may be that people feel less willing to take risks so long as there is this uncertainty. But there are always going to be firms that are hiring. There are going to be ways in which people break out, perhaps out of necessity, of the routines, the structures, the safety net that they had. And for some people who are in a position to do so, they may discover new passions, new entrepreneurial opportunities as this evolves. It'll change for people over time. It's hard to think about making big life changes when the world has changed so much. I think as we get greater clarity, especially on the health side, to then understand what the economy might look like for the medium to longer term, that's when we'll really see both some new challenges, but also some new opportunities.
And Indeed sits right in the middle of this, right? Indeed's the largest job site in the world. We are a marketplace of job seekers and employers, and we have a mission to help people get jobs and really take a job seeker first approach to the world. How can Indeed be most helpful out in the world in these days, in your point of view?
I think, first of all, the work that we do to get information out, what's happening in the labor market, which firms are hiring, and helping people through the process. So the changes that we're seeing right now, it's not just the change in the number of jobs out there or the kinds of jobs out there, but it's also the process by which you go about finding a job and interviewing for a job. We've already pivoted to making so many of our offerings virtual, adapting to how both employers are searching and how job seekers are seeking different kinds of work. So I think it's both the process by which we help people get jobs and the information that we're able to give employers, job seekers, and policymakers to help us all get through this period as best we can.
Well, Jed Kolko, Chief Economist at Indeed, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insights on the current crisis and the outlook for the future. Really appreciate your input.
Great, and thanks for all the great questions.
Thank you, Jed.